Dr. Levin, why should we study tradition?
Well, tradition is necessary for progress, for one thing. And if the desire for progress and the need for progress is one thing we agree about in the modern world, we have to understand progress as building on what we have, not as pulled by an abstract ideal, but as built upon great achievements. And that means we have to understand what we're building on, and what's best about it and what's worst about it. So tradition matters not only because it speaks to us of the past, but because it's absolutely essential to the future. And if it's both of those things, then we really ought to study it.
And so if tradition is necessary for progress, what are some of the things that stand in the way of our study of tradition? What are some of tradition's great rivals?
I think today the greatest rival is an idea of progress that doesn't have room for tradition, an idea of progress that's defined by a sense of a future ideal that's not well rooted in human realities and in the human story. And so an idea of progress that's much too abstract and that draws on utopianisms that aren't rooted in human reality. And the corrective to that is tradition, which tells us of attempts over and over, generation after generation, to improve the world, some of which worked and some of which haven't, some of which can help us learn lessons about what to do and about what not to do, and some of which seem to point to truths that are more than human truths. And if we're going to succeed in making progress, we need to know that. The idea that we don't, that the past is just a burden, is very appealing. The idea that our fathers were fools appeals to young men, but that's no way to live.
And so if you were to describe what you have in mind for a study of tradition like this, what are some of the big questions, and who are some of the best guides that can help us think about them?
In a sense, the question is the tension between forward and backward, between progress and tradition. And it's a tension that's been with us in the West from the beginning, or at least as far back as we can find the beginning. It's a funny thing that our tradition is a tradition of tension between tradition and progress. So that if we look to the great guides for all philosophical questions, we'll find they have a lot to say about this. If we look to Plato and to Aristotle, we'll find them struggling with what the past should mean for us in the present, and whether we can think our way out of the need to look to tradition for wisdom. If we then look at some of the great religious thinkers who were informed both by revealed truth and by the truths of philosophy, we'll find them too struggling with the tension between the obligations that tradition imposes and the appeal of a philosophy that might be able to look beyond received wisdom. And if we look to the modern world, which is so obsessed with progress and believes so intently in the possibility of just moving forward without looking backward, we'll find constantly a whole variety of critics, conservatives of all parties, you might say, who say that in fact this forward motion has to be guided by some understanding of the best of what we've done. And so it seems to me that in every generation and in every stage of history we find people who are struggling with the question of what the past should mean to us as we build the future.
In parallel with our philosophical investigation, do you see the questions of freedom and tradition arise in the tradition of American politics?
Absolutely. You know, Americans have had to deal with a strange problem, which is that we're a nation founded in revolution that wants to conserve its political heritage. And conservatives in America, who are America's traditionalists above all, are conserving a tradition begun in that revolution. And one of our greatest teachers on all things American, Abraham Lincoln, struggled with this very problem very profoundly and had to help the country move from a place where it understood itself as still being born, as still undergoing a revolution, to a place where we could think of our own revolution as a source of traditional wisdom, as a source of insight that that harkens us back when we think of how to move forward. Lincoln begins to think about the revolution by seeing it as a philosophical achievement, by seeing it as a source of principles. And by the end, at his most difficult moment as he's taking on the presidency, he calls on Americans to remember and calls on us to look to the mystic chords of memory as sources of wisdom. And you can see him learning himself over time that the founding is not only a source of principles, it's also a source of tradition.